Throughout human history, tribes in Northern Europe and indigenous populations in the Americas and Asia have lived in and from forests. Let's not revert to attitudes like back then everything was better, or having a hunters and gatherer diet is much more healthy. Let's look what we can learn from the forest for the 21st century food production system. I'm your host Manuel Löffler, and welcome to Disruptive Innovation Festival, an online festival that is all around the question: the economy is changing, what do I need to know, experience and do? In the session today, lessons from the forest can contribute to this big overarching question. So I'm really happy to have both Greg Johnson from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as well as Martin Crawford, an experienced forest gardener, with me today to answer this big question: how these forest gardens can contribute to our food production systems. I particularly want to give a shout out to Martin, who has been described as someone creating what is almost certainly the best forest garden in the temperate world, and the breadth of his knowledge matches the depth of his experience. And to get an idea of that, we will first in the session watch a video about how this forest garden looks like, and then we'll come back and have Craig and Martin answering your questions, and that's the important one, bringing your questions. It's a great privilege to have this video because I've seen Martin's forest garden, but with my untrained eye, I couldn't see everything that was going on there, all the practices and theory of permaculture, regenerative agriculture, and so on that went into it. But let's first have a look at the video before we continue.
A forest garden is a layered system of trees, shrubs, perennials and ground covers designed and planted to maximize beneficial species interactions and minimize competitive effects, with the aim of growing a wide diversity of crops, mainly edible plants, but it could be plants for all sorts of other uses, including medicinal plants, and also with the aim of achieving a very low input system, low energy input that is, and good output. Another way to think of a forest garden is as a diversified orchard. So in other words, you start off with your orchard trees, mostly fruit trees of course, and then you start to diversify. You underplant. Downwards you diversify with shrubs and ground covers and perennial crops. And then occasionally you also overplant. In other words, between the trees and above the trees will tower the occasional higher tree, certainly if your system has space. Here, an Italian alder just behind the apple tree. So forest gardens have a very long history in the world. At least 14,000 years from Southeast Asia, probably much longer. In fact, when humans just interacted with forests, they would turn them into forest gardens. They would cut some trees, they would encourage others, they would probably plant the seeds of others, particular fruit trees they wanted or whatever. And you'd gradually turn a natural forest, if there is such a thing, into a forest garden. It's a process of kind of co-evolution. But that history is mostly from the subtropics and the tropics. In the northern hemisphere, forest gardens have a much shorter history, about 40 years in Western Europe and North America. But one of the things in these climates, of course, is we're further north, we're further from the equator, the sun doesn't get as high, we have to be much more careful with how much sun we let through to be able to grow plants between and underneath trees. So tree spacing is critically important here. And of course, you can't put trees together so closely here as you could in the tropics, because there just won't be enough light underneath them to be able to grow a big diversity of plants. Another critical feature of forest gardens is that they're a layered system. There are layers of trees, from high trees if your system's big enough, smaller trees, shrubs, perennials and ground covering plants down low. So the resources, the aerial resources, the soil resources, they're all used very efficiently, much more efficiently than a single crop can ever do. Another key feature is diversity. Diversity is so important. That is how you get a resilient system, having a lot of different species in it. In this garden there are several hundred. In most forest gardens there are at least 100, probably more, which compared with a monoculture is vastly different. That diversity is one way we're mimicking nature. We're mimicking the diversity of nature, or sometimes even increasing the diversity you find in nature to make a very resilient system, resilient against pests, resilient against diseases, and resilient against whatever the climate throws at it. And of course, in an era of climate change, what is damaging plants, and will do so increasingly, is not the gradual increase in temperatures, but the increase in weather extremes. It's the floods, it's the droughts, etc., that damage plants. And systems based on perennial plants and based on diversity are much more resilient. Another key feature of a forest garden is minimal soil cultivation. The soil is basically covered all year, if possible, certainly most of the year, by living plants, ground covers, perennial crops and so on. You have to remember that annuals are very rare in nature, and actually basing our agriculture on annual plants is in many ways very unnatural. Annual plants are not very sustainable. They're weak, they're susceptible to drought, they're susceptible to floods. Perennial plants are much more resilient. They have bigger root systems, they're more stable, and they can cope with climate variations in a way that annual plants can't. There are system plants. System plants are there to help the system function. They may not be crops for you at all. So comfrey, for example, here, is a fantastic bee plant. It's very important to keep your bees happy and your pollinators happy. It's also a very good mineral accumulator, making minerals available in time to other plants. Ponds attract lots of wildlife that will catch your pests. So by having a diverse system and things like a pond and system plants to attract beneficial insects, you won't get any insect pests. Forest gardens are very low input systems. The input is mainly human labour. They're complex systems. They're not suitable for machine harvesting. There are fruits. Most people have fruit trees and fruit bushes in their forest gardens. That can include all the common fruits like pears here, but it can have lots of uncommon fruits as well. There are lots of different kinds of fruit trees from all over the world with interesting and tasty fruits. There are nut crops, things like sweet chestnut here, fantastically productive carbohydrate crops on trees. There are also things like walnuts and hazelnuts, oily nuts with very, very healthy oils in them. Probably much healthier for us to eat a lot of them than a lot of carbohydrate. There are seed crops you can grow. This is bladdernut, an understory tree from mainland Europe, very easy to grow in the shade beneath other trees and shrubs in a forest garden. There are lots of tuber crops and tuberous vegetables, root vegetables you can grow that are perennial in this system. This one is a perennial type of nasturtium called mashua that actually is here for the edible tubers, big edible white tubers from South America, where it's a commercial crop there. The leaves also edible as a vegetable. There are salad vegetables, for example, lime leaves from pollarded lime trees instead of something like a lettuce. There are herbs. Herbs not only to eat, but also to make the forest garden a lovely place to be in, with all their aromas. And also, a lot of herbs are very good system plants as well. Herbs like the sweet cicely you can see here in the foreground and the peppermint behind it are extremely good at attracting beneficial insects as well as being nice plants to eat. So within a system function, role, they're very important in a forest garden too. There are spice crops. This is Szechuan pepper, and there are a number of spices you can grow on trees and shrubs. Some of them very high value as well as an economic crop. Mushrooms are another fantastic crop, very suitable for growing in a forest garden. These are my shiitake mushroom logs here. Oak logs inoculated with shiitake fungus, and they are incredibly productive producing mushrooms. There can be industrial products like pine resin from pine trees, for example. Pine resin is a mixture of complex hydrocarbons and is incredibly useful stuff. It's usually distilled to make turpentine and rosin. Those are the two products from distillation. And then those are used in industry to make a load of other things. There are crops to grow for poles, canes, bamboos, for example, are a fantastic crop for forest gardens. Not only do you get the canes to use or sell, but also you get edible bamboo shoots through the spring as a perennial vegetable. You can also grow fuel wood, coppice for firewood, for example, or indeed you might coppice or pollard to produce logs to grow mushrooms on. You might have plants for tying or fibre use, like this New Zealand flax, whose leaves are incredibly strong. And you can split into lengths and then use for tying. You can tie knots with it. All sorts of garden tying jobs only need biodegradable twine, and this is perfect. There are lots of environmental benefits from forest gardens. They sustain a fantastic range of wildlife. Invertebrate levels can be very, very high. They sequester a lot of carbon as well into the woody mass of the plants, and also sequestering into soil and increasing soil carbon levels, which is a huge issue. Forest gardens are aesthetically beautiful places. They often have a semi-wild feel to them, even though they're cultivated. It does feel as though you're working with nature and are close to nature by being in it, much more so than in a field of grass or a field of wheat. Forest gardens are very efficient systems of production. By efficiency, I'm talking mainly about energy efficiency. You have to remember, annual crops take a huge amount of energy to grow. And that's because the further your system is away from woodland, the more energy you have to put in to maintain it. And digging the soil, cultivating the soil, takes a huge amount of energy. And in the long term, without oil, is it even possible? I don't know. So can forest gardens be commercial? That's a tricky question. Forest gardens, as you've seen, they're complex systems. They have lots of different plants. They have plants mixed together. Nothing's in lines. These are all things that from a commercial point of view are not good. Commercial systems for making money like to be very simple. One crop, maybe two. Straight lines make harvesting efficient. There's nothing like that in here. So how do you reconcile those two things? Only really by increasing the value that is paid for food, increasing the value that society pays for environmentally sustainable growing systems. That's really the only way it can happen.
It was great to see this video again, and just to summarize, forest gardens mimic nature, and through biodiversity establishing resilient production systems, we can get food like nuts, we can get tuber crops, mushrooms, and even industrial products. We can get timber, fuel, and fiber out of this. And Martin already hinted towards this big question, can it be scaled? But I don't want to take any more time of you away and want to hand over to Craig, who will have the honor to introduce Martin a little bit more so everyone knows who we're talking to here, and then take your questions to Martin as well. Craig, are you there?
Yeah, we're here, Manuel. Many thanks for that. The great film there. And just to check, Martin, you're okay online there?
Yeah, I'm here.
That's great. So yeah, we've got these questions coming in already, everyone. But I just very briefly let me introduce Martin before we get into those questions. I'm sure again maybe you've seen the details on the diff sort of schedule, but to let you know that Martin's been in this field 20 years plus in organic agriculture, horticulture. He's author of a very interesting book called Creating a Forest Garden, Working with Nature to Grow Edible Crops. You get a sense of that straight away in that film. And again, to let you know that he is the director of the Agroforestry Research Trust. And they focus very much on temperate agroforestry systems, particularly focusing on those tree and perennial crops. I think that sort of temperate focus is interesting, and I think we're going to pick up something on the tropical side by the looks of things on some of these questions. But Martin, just to sort of kick off with the first question, and this one, maybe let's just look on the ecology side a little bit. This one on nutrient stocks and flows in the forest system. And you mentioned there, I think, about these nutrient accumulator plants. Could you tell us a little bit about those and their relationships with soil fungi?
Yeah, I mean, the relationships actually are not very well known because there just hasn't been that much research done. But with something like comfrey, it particularly accumulates potassium. So its roots, almost certainly in combination with fungi, although, you know, that has to be determined, are especially efficient at getting potassium out of the soil, and especially out of the subsoil, because the roots go down quite deep. So the top part of the plants become very rich in potassium, and you can either cut those and leave them to you know, decompose, or indeed when the plants die down for the winter, of course they'll take some of those nutrients back into their root systems to store for the winter, but the rest will decay in the dying foliage and go back into the soil. Right. So I'm sure fungi are involved because fungi actually are much more efficient at getting nutrients out of the soil than any plant roots ever are. Right. But it hasn't really been researched very much.
Oh, that's interesting. But just on, so how deep do those roots go down on something like comfrey then? Those are going down?
They can go down several meters. Whereas, you know, in Britain, tree roots don't usually go more than about a meter.
Yes. So it's that whole thing of the nutrients sort of flows coming up from quite deep down to that top layer.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, just a question here. This idea again of the nutrients getting out of the system, that you harvest crops from your forest garden that takes away nutrients from the area, but if you're not adding artificial NPK fertilizers to replace those nutrients, how do you regenerate soil fertility in that forest garden?
Okay, well, some nutrients are generated on site, so that is typically something like nitrogen. Most of the nitrogen in my forest garden is generated by nitrogen fixing plants. So it's taken out of the air by the bacteria working with nitrogen fixing plants, and some of that eventually becomes available to the system. Other nutrients are returned. So, for example, there's a compost toilet for some human nutrients, you know, human waste to get returned. Food scraps, you know, vegetable waste and stuff like that gets returned as well. So, I mean, you can't necessarily, keep taking and assume that natural systems can sustain fertility, because that might not be the case. But it is worth saying that most perennial crops need less fertility than annual plants do. So you don't actually need to sustain such high fertility as, you know, a field of vegetable, you know, a field of potatoes or whatever.
Okay. And we've got a question here from Mike Hewitt, someone here looking, I think, for some advice here already. He's asking for some tips on polycultures in the herbaceous layer in those forest gardens. Maybe you could clarify a bit what that is. He's asking, can you give tips about polycultures for the herbaceous layer of my forest garden? A mixture of species planted singularly in a matrix would seem to be better mimicking the natural forest system, but mixed blocks of planting seem to have practical advantages. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, mixing plants together, which is what a polyculture is, you know, it's the theory is all good about it. You know, it all increases diversity and resilience, but you have to add in some practicality as well in terms of practicality of management and practicality of harvesting. So when I'm designing the herbaceous layer low down, so that's sort of from ground level up to a meter high, something like that. One of the key things I think about is crops at different heights. So even that layer I tend to think of as itself a layered system, with certainly 2 layers, maybe more, but certainly 2. So I tend to have something very low that tends to be a very good ground covering plant that hopefully is a crop as well, maybe something like wild strawberries, for example, and something a higher growing perennial that comes up above that, and so the 2 crop heights are distinctly different. That makes both maintenance and any harvesting much easier. Because the plants aren't sort of interfering with each other, you know, when you're trying to get them. If you plant 2 plants, 2 different species together, that all grow to the same height and they're all mixed together, it's going to take you an age to sort through one just to harvest the other. So you know, you've got to factor in that these kind of practical aspects as well. Okay,
that's great. We're getting these questions in here again. It's getting you for advice here, I reckon. This is from Brian, and we lose crops to squirrels. Mice take the gooseberries. Strawberries, birds such as parakeets flying for breakfast. So how do we get a fair share for ourselves?
Oh, fair share. Well, you know, as I mentioned in that video, you know, insect pests are relatively easy to manage as long as you can attract their predators and such like. But when you're getting onto bigger pests, you know, there's no simple answer. There's no simple answer to bird pests apart from use scaring devices. You know, birds get used to something after between 5 and 7 days. So any scaring device you use will only work that long. You have to change it and use something else. So, you know, whether it's things you hang in trees to flash or whatever, there's lots of different things you can use. With things like squirrels, I guess we're talking grey squirrels in Britain, which are an imported squirrel from North America. And they're a terrible pest on nut trees, especially in terms of crops you're trying to grow. And there's no alternative but to control squirrel numbers if you want to grow nuts in Britain, unless you live on an island somewhere, you know, or up in the north of Scotland. You've got to control squirrel numbers. That means reducing squirrel numbers. It means killing squirrels one way or another. It's, you know, it's something you have to face if you want to grow a crop and there's such a bad pest.
Can't you get in there then quicker than the squirrels, or do they know they're ready before you?
Well, with things like hazelnuts and walnuts, they will usually take the nuts off the tree before they're fully ripe. So they'll get in there before you. Yeah.
Okay, look, that's great. So there was some practical advice there. Maybe a question coming here on some of the broader design principles. Here, are your biomimetic design principles for forest gardens relevant to large-scale commercial farms and forests? And how would you introduce those principles to farmers and foresters who are showing interest in moving away from monoculture annuals and tree crops? What would be the principles you really say that might resonate with them?
Okay, well, there's many different types of agroforestry. Forest gardens are one type. They're a more intensive type, and really their whole design and complexity means that they're usually smaller scale. So I'm talking up to 15 acres, maybe
Right.
6 hectares, that kind of scale. Once you get beyond that, the complexity becomes too much usually for people to manage. So when you're looking bigger than that, in terms of farm scale agroforestry, really you're looking at different kind of systems. So silvo-arable or alley cropping is basically lines of trees in fields, and you still cultivate in between them, maybe still grow your wheat or your annual crops or whatever they are in between them. That is probably the next most popular type of agroforestry with farmers in Europe. Unfortunately, farmers in Britain don't do very much of that, and that's partly because farmers in some parts of Europe can get funding to set up those systems through the agricultural grant system, but the British government, in its infinite wisdom, has decided not to opt into that, so British farmers can't get those grants. Right. So that's a disincentive, for them to be able to do that. But that is. It's not a terribly complex system, but it's much better than a monoculture. You don't have to have a single crop in a row. It could be just a line of walnuts with alleys of say 30 meters between each line, which are still cultivated. Or you could have several different tree crops in those rows. It doesn't have to be a single tree crop. So you still get a lot of benefits from the trees and the increase in diversity. Not as many benefits as with a really diverse system like a forest garden.
That's very helpful, Martin. I think that's to hear you almost like that. It's interesting that sort of definitions really of forest gardens to agroforestry system. It sounds like you're just saying it's the scale and size thing, but also the complexity. Although it seems a bit, I don't know anything about that. That's a bit sad, isn't it? Those large-scale agroforestry. You would hope they could get close to mimicking that complexity in your small-scale foresting, but you're pointing out, the practical side of that maybe that's not realistic.
Yeah, and you have to remember, certainly in Britain, generally, farmers don't know very much about trees. And of course, foresters don't know very much about farming, and agroforestry is right stuck in the middle, which can be quite a difficult place to access for either of those groups. Yeah. So for farmers, that is a very understandable diversification, and it could be a first step in further diversification, and making their systems more complex. So, but it's a good first step.
Yeah. Okay. And so we got a question. We're going to have to try and get through as many as we can here. So we talked about nutrients in the system. That's nice. But a question here around, it's almost like on the carbon here, in the sugar side here, and how forest gardens can help combat climate change and carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere. So how good are forest gardens at fixing carbon from the atmosphere, building organic matter, and how do they compare to commercial forestry plantation at this fixation process?
That's a very interesting question, and there have been some studies done, but because forest gardens in our climates are relatively recent, a lot of the work's been done on tropical forest gardens, and what's relevant and what works there obviously not necessarily the same here. Our own forest garden here in Dartington, by my calculations, it's been sequestering into the soil about between 10 and 12 tons of carbon per year since it started, and that was 24 years ago. And that's a result of trees storing carbon in the soil, the humus levels in the soil, the organic matter levels rising, because that's where most of the carbon is stored. There's obviously root matter and all that stuff in the soil as well. In addition to that, of course, there's all the above ground biomass. and more studies need to be done, but they obviously can be very highly efficient at capturing and storing carbon.
No, that's interesting, because I'm sure that is the thing. There's a whole debate, isn't it, about the fixing. I know even with the, we're working with some of these colleagues on sort of these sort of complex sort of grazing systems, grassland systems, and how much they can fix, with the cattle systems, organic systems. So I think that's interesting. The masses of grasslands, can they contribute to it? But again, the idea of sort of forest is probably more important, isn't it, in the round, probably. But that's interesting. Just a question here on, you're giving a sense maybe of other examples in the UK and Europe. You mentioned sort of temperate thing. I know I suppose another question again from me as well, that in terms of tropical forest gardens, what's the sort of state of play in Europe, say, compared to tropical?
Okay, I mean, there's forest gardens all over Europe and all over North America that have been started in the last 45 years.
Yeah.
But when I referred to the very long history of forest gardening in that video, I was referring to the tropics and the subtropics, where there's thousands of square miles of forest gardens still. They're often not even called forest gardens. They're often just called home gardens.
Right.
But the structure is the same as a forest garden. They're usually around a homestead. They're usually full of crops that first and foremost are used by the people who live there and who own it. There may be a few commercial crops in there as well, but that's not the overriding rationale for that kind of system. The system is for basically for sustenance and a kind of sustainable system to produce that.
Right. Okay. And someone just asking a question here. I mean, you mentioned it in the film, but you might maybe just expand on it a little bit. Can forest gardens be commercial? What would be the challenges of scaling up the forest garden model?
Yeah, I mean, there's inherent difficulties in a forest garden system and commercial as economics defines commercial at the moment, and that's because economically complex systems are less profitable because complex systems need more management. Harvesting may be more complex and takes more time, and so on. So I don't regard that as a problem with forest gardens. Right. I regard that as a problem with economics.
Yeah, actually.
Right. Because economics still does not take into account any kind of sustainability indicator for whatever food system, whatever foods come from, and ironically, in fact, in Britain, farmers get basically paid through subsidies for farming not very sustainably, and the people who are farming sustainably tend not to get subsidies. So right. Actually, it's absolutely the wrong way round. The challenges of making a forest garden more commercial are obviously, you need to reduce the complexity a little bit, but not too much. And where that level is quite difficult to say exactly. But so that crops are more efficient to harvest, or your apple trees of one variety are relatively close to each other. They're not completely scattered right across a site. So if you're harvesting that particular type of apple, it can be done quicker and more efficiently. So there are ways to make more commercial forest gardens. There are a few people making commercial forest gardens in this country, but it's always a trade-off. Okay. In terms of sustainability and resilience and those things, it's a trade-off.
Okay. And I'm just watching time here, but the question coming in from one of our colleagues here on our cities program side, I'm thinking about what might be the relevance here. Your thoughts on the vision for regenerative food growing in and around cities, and how would forest gardens fit in with, say, market gardens, hydroponics, aquaponics? Maybe it's not a question here of large scale. I think she's getting at this idea small scale, but replicating it in big ways across an area. Could that work?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot going on in cities. There's quite a lot of forest gardens in London, for example, and other cities in this country. Interestingly, what's been happening in the last few years is quite a lot of people have started working in public parks with the with the permission of the authorities, because partly because the authorities are strapped for money and don't have any money to maintain these things anymore. So they're very happy for people to go in and take a section of park and actually do something more interesting there and maintain it themselves. So I think there's a very good future really for that, because actually public park spaces can be made really interesting by more planting of trees. I know some people like open spaces. You've got to have some open spaces as well, but I'm not saying plant trees absolutely everywhere, but I think they have forest gardens in cities have a useful role. There's also people actually making forest gardens on top of roofs, for example.
Yes.
In a relatively small scale, but still very interesting.
Okay, that's it's slightly related to that one. I think is someone asking here, would you have any advice to the British government to promote alternative food production systems? Well, that's interesting. I mean, sort of national level. Oh my God. Well, I'm still more excited what you're saying there. I would have thought again. I can see regional city governments playing a role in the public sector linked with young entrepreneurs growing, but. Would you think there is a role, or would you tend to?
Well, presumably there'll have to be a role if we're leaving Europe. It's a difficult one. I'm a believer in doing something that feels right, and not being dependent on some official body to be able to do that. So really, I'm not that fond of a sort of grant system or that kind of thing. Although it can certainly help in some ways.
Okay,
But unfortunately, the governments in Britain of whatever hue have not seemed to be able to understand what sustainability means in terms of land use, in terms of food production. And I know people are trying to tell them, but they don't seem to get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and so I think we just got around 5 minutes, so now we've got to take a couple more questions. This is quite a nice area to get into, if you can give us a few ideas here. Yeah, so someone here, in terms of knowledge of forest garden design and management, with your knowledge, what would you say are the research priorities around forest gardens? Does anything stand out where you need to, maybe academic, or maybe a more applied type of research?
The most urgent need, I think, is for more measurement of yields in different kinds of shade as well, measurement of yields of perennial crops. There just hasn't been enough of that.
Okay.
So that there's good answers, to people say, well, my patch of carrots yields this much. How much will your patch of mashua yield, or Solomon seal, or some other unusual perennial? So I think that's the key priority.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe make this. Maybe this is one of the last questions here. Someone here in terms of trying to broaden this out. Are there lessons here for business organisations in general? Maybe are there any relevant principles here for corporates outside the food forestry sector?
I think there are, because a forest garden, or a very sustainable, resilient food growing system is basically very cyclic, and basically everything gets recycled back into the system. That's what makes it sustainable, and I think business can learn from that. And actually, when I take business people around my forest garden, a lot of them get that very, very quickly, actually, and that if you don't pay attention to nutrient flows, say, that are leaving and you're not replacing, that can't be sustainable.
Right. Okay, Martin, I think we'll just take one more question related to that here. If businesses visited your vertical farms or your forest garden here, what would you want them to take away as transferable ideas?
Yes. Don't be afraid of complexity.
Right.
We've had a long history in both in food growing and in business, really, of everything being simplified to make it maybe more profitable. But actually, we need to start going the other way. We need to make things more complex. You do need specific knowledge to be able to do that.
Right.
So you need to inform yourself and learn how to do that. But I think complex systems managed the right way can be very, very resilient, and that goes for businesses as well as food producing systems.
That's lovely, Martin. Well, look, I think we're running out of time now, so I just really wanted to thank you for that session. That's lovely to get that sort of feedback from you there. I mean, yeah, nutrient accumulators. I like these ideas, system plants in complex dynamic systems you were talking about there, and that diversity of crops, spice crops, mushroom logs. The idea you've talked about, I got quite nice about ideas of resilience and diversity in systems. That's very interesting. Again, at the foundation with our circular economy work, we're very interested in that in terms of how that works in natural systems and how they might be applicable or not into some of these economic and business systems. Yeah. So that's all very nice. And I think the whole thing of the soil dynamics, minimum soil tillage, that's very helpful. So, thanks again, really. And I'm going to have to hand back to Manuel in the studio there. Are you around there, Manuel?
I am around and listening to you. Thank you so much for that conversation and all the questions that came in from the audience. I just want to rephrase Martin. That was a really good cue. Don't be afraid of complexity. When we need to make things more complex, you need to inform yourself, though, on how to do that. So it's often important to actually know the basics of what you're doing and don't think you can jump out and do it. But once complex systems are there, they can be quite resilient. And diversity is a big part of that. And that's what happens at a DIF. We have contributions as today from the plant growers, from permaculturalists, from people with big visions. Others go more into the technology side of things. And maybe you want to look at urban food systems, which was a session that ran on the 21st of November. Or you want to look at Soils and Seas Renewed, which also give a great perspective. That one ran on the 22nd of November, and they're all available in catch-up. So if you have a MyDiff account, you can all watch them. And today, if you're around at 3 p.m., we have a special thing happening. It's an exclusive news feed around the Economic Prosperity Reinvented, which is a publication by one of our Al MacArthur Foundation members that gives some new insights, what's actually happening with our economic system. And back to the question of economy is changing. What do I need to know, experience, and do? That's everything for this session today. Stay tuned and hang around for the diff.